Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913. And Woodrow Wilson proceeded to, well, this is one where you see the interplay between presidents as leaders and presidents as simply presiding over the executive branch. It was under Woodrow Wilson that the federal workforce became segregated. The post office became segregated, other branches, other aspects of the executive branch became segregated. And it was largely at the behest of some of the Southerners in Wilson's cabinet. Wilson went along with it. And this was an example of, well, what a lot of people thought as kind of retrograde motion in politics. Because there was this tendency, this hope to think that, well, the Civil War is over and aren't we moving forward on racial issues? And under Wilson, it seemed as though, no, we're moving backwards on racial issues. But in one sense, there was this backward motion. In another sense, you could argue, though, that it was the beginning of kind of the nationalization of race policy. And in this regard, maybe it was one of those necessary steps forward. I wrote a book on the California Gold Rush. And one of the things that I was surprised to discover, I hadn't realized this, because I hadn't really thought about how you traveled from the eastern United States to California in 1849. Well, the way you did it was to go through Missouri. And typically the jumping off point for the overland trail was Independence, Missouri, St. Joseph, Missouri, Council Bluffs, one of the communities on the western edge of Missouri. Well, now, those of you who recall your history will remember that because of the Missouri Compromise, the state of Missouri was a slave state. And so what this meant was that to get from New York, a free state, to California, a free state, it's going to be a free state after 1850, to get from the north to the west, you had to travel through the south. Okay, now, that might seem like it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not too much when it came to the question of slavery. This is important because, for the first time, Northerners who never would have traveled to the south, most people who lived in New York had no reason to travel to the south. They never would have seen the slave system in action. But because they were going to California. They didn't intend to go to the south. They wanted to go to California and dig gold. But to get to California, they had to go through a slave state. And they saw for the first time in the slave market, St. Louis, for example, the way the slave system operated. And this had a galvanizing effect on the abolitionist movement. It was only when this issue, when this institution became real, that people were really able to envision it and to mobilize against it. So anyway, it was this kind of odd quirk of history that the slave question became nationalized. And once it became nationalized, then it was possible to mobilize national opinion against it. It was when the Jim Crow system became nationalized in the federal government under Wilson that a greater groundswell of opposition arose against it. As long as segregation was a Southern issue, then people in Massachusetts could just go to bed at night with clear consciences. Well, not my problem. They didn't have to look at it. They didn't have to deal with it. Franklin Roosevelt, whom I have particular interest in these days, was one who also understood that you could get a little bit ahead of the American people on certain issues, but you couldn't get very much farther ahead, because if you did, you would lose them. And when I look at Franklin Roosevelt, I'm spending a lot of time in my book on Franklin Roosevelt dealing with Eleanor Roosevelt, because Eleanor Roosevelt was, yeah, it's fair to say, even including Clinton, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, and Bill Clinton in the White House and Hillary as First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt was the most powerful First Lady in American history. She was the first American First Lady to have any kind of independent views of politics and any independent venue. She wrote a 6-day-a-week newspaper column. She had a weekly radio show. And she often spoke on topics and espoused positions at variance with those of her husband. And this is one of the reasons that she was considered with such respect by women and men too during her time, and has been viewed as really sort of the first feminist in the White House. She wasn't president, but she lived in the White House. And Eleanor Roosevelt was something of Franklin Roosevelt's conscience on civil rights. And she was constantly pushing Franklin Roosevelt to do more for civil rights. To get behind, for example, a resolution introduced in Congress to create a federal anti-lynch law. Lynching remained a serious problem through the American South. And the laws in the South weren't sufficient to deal with it. I was just on a panel a couple of days ago at the Texas State Historical Association. And the panel dealt with the legal system in Texas in the 1880s and 1890s, and the legal system in the United States in the 1880s and 90s. And there was a political scientist who was talking about the U.S. Supreme Court during the 1880s and 90s, and a historian from the University of Texas who was talking about the Texas Supreme Court during the 80s and 90s. And it was interesting to see the much larger importance of the populist movement on Texas law and Texas constitutionalism than the influence of populism on U.S. law and constitution, because actually the populist movement had zero effect, at least observable effect, on U.S. law. And so the question arose, why were the populists so much more effective in changing the law and the interpretation of the Constitution in Texas than they were regarding federal law? Any guesses? Any thoughts? Now, I confess that I don't, and the answer to the question hinges on how you choose judges. And I don't know how judges in Michigan are chosen. Are they appointed, elected? Elected. Okay, well then you might know the answer. So what's the answer? Why is the Texas Supreme Court more responsive to the popular will than the U.S. Supreme Court? Because the judges are elected, and they listen to what voters are saying, because they know that if they get very far out of step, they won't be returned to office. Now, does it happen in Michigan the way it typically happens in Texas? At least it did for a long time. Recently it's changed a little bit, in that the justices of the Texas Supreme Court were typically appointed originally, because there was this custom that if somebody wanted to retire, resign from the court, they would do so before the end of the term. And this would give the governor the courtesy, the opportunity to appoint the successor. But then that successor had to stand for election the next time around. They would have the advantage of incumbency, but they'd still have to get elected. So it diluted the effect of the voting a little bit. Anyway, what this meant in Texas was that populist interpretations of railroad regulation worked out through the Texas Supreme Court, but not through the U.S. Supreme Court. But what it also meant was that on issues like lynching, it was impossible to convict anybody, any white person, of lynching a black man in Texas or in any other southern state, because the judges, the juries, were all whites and were typically sympathetic to those people doing the lynching. And this was why there was demand for a federal law. Because if you could get it in the federal court system, then the judges were appointed. They didn't have to run for election. It didn't make any difference if they were unpopular or not. And this was why, for example, that federal civil rights legislation of the 1960s federalized a lot of these offenses, precisely to take it out of the state court system and put it into the federal court system, where the federal courts, where the federal judges can be very unpopular and still do their job. In fact, one would argue that on certain issues, if you're not unpopular as a judge, you're not doing your job. Anyway, Franklin Roosevelt refused to sign on to the anti-lynching legislation. He refused to get out front on civil rights, despite the pleas, more than pleas, despite the demands of Eleanor that he do something about it.